Hi, everyone. And on behalf of the WIN New York and WIN Chicago chapters, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on construction and COVID. My name's Sarah Fitz. I am a partner at Schiff Hardin, and I am also a board member of WIN in New York. And I'm joined by Jenna.
Yep. Hi, I'm Jenna Brose. I am with AECOM. And as Sarah mentioned, I am a board member of the Chicago chapter, and we are so excited about partnering with the New York chapter today for this event.
Right. So we're not going to take a lot of time with the introductions because there's a lot of good material coming. But just briefly, Women's Infrastructure Network is a global professional organization with chapters in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, London, Paris, New York, Chicago, LA. And we would be very excited for people in the audience who haven't participated in our events before to reach out afterwards if you would like to learn more about us. So let me start by introducing the moderator. The moderator is Diana Parks. She's been in the infrastructure and P3 industry assisting public and private clients for over 20 years. Over the course of her career, she's been in private practice for medium and large firms and served as senior in-house positions at Bechtel and Tudor Perini, leading complex civil infrastructure projects. Diana recently formed her own legal services firm, which will soon have WBE status, and continues to team with her former colleagues and peers in the industry to provide a full spectrum of services. With that, I let the program begin.
Thank you, Sarah, for the very nice introduction. I will ask the panelists to give a brief introduction of themselves, and then we will dive into the presentation and panel. Palmina, would you like to start, please?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Palmina Whelan. I'm a former airline executive for American Airlines, recently retired. My portfolio including managing the CIP program and all master redevelopment programs within the Northeast, Central US, and Dallas. It's nice to meet you all.
Thank you, Palmina. Alexandra?
Good afternoon. I'm Alexandra Perotti. I'm the Director of Operations for Holt Construction. Holt Construction is a national construction management and general construction firm celebrating our 100 years in the industry last year. I've been in the construction industry for over 26 years.
Thank you. Amanda.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mandy MacVey. I am a partner in the construction law group of Schiff Hardin, and I'm in the DC office. And while my focus has been on construction law my entire career, and I've done everything soup to nuts, I live and breathe boots on the ground in the construction trailer, typically in the role of project counsel. So helping the project team deal with the day-to-day issues of disputed change orders and claims and helping resolve those issues in real time, sometimes using alternative dispute resolution, but to achieve the goal of the project ending on time and on budget.
Thank you. Beth?
Hi, I'm Beth Matzko. I'm a Senior Vice President in the Alliance Construction Risk Services Group, handling large general contractors throughout the country for their primary casualty and property programs.
Thank you. And last but not least, Heidi.
Hello, everyone. My name is Heidi Rao. I'm a partner in Schiff's Construction Law Group and the Deputy Practice Group Leader. I primarily focus my representation on representing large project owners and developers and REITs across the country from coast to coast and everywhere in between. So I've been in the thick of things in terms of dealing with claims that are COVID related on ongoing projects, and also trying to help parties figure out strategies for managing COVID related risks on projects that are yet to get underway. But I work on everything from industrial projects to office towers, luxury condominiums, and my favorite, the complicated mixed-use developments.
Thank you. Thank you all. We'll dive into the panel discussion topics. The purpose of this WebEx is to provide some relevant takeaways on COVID issues as they relate to the construction and infrastructure industry, and we hope that these discussions are helpful. Please feel free to send questions in the chat. We will do our best, depending on time, to answer some of those questions after the presentation, but if we do not get to that, we will reach out to you individually and try to provide responses. So starting it off, with there being both national COVID guidelines and state local guidelines, there's constant evolution of these rules and guidelines governing the construction industry. Are there any notable patterns or consistencies and/or differences, either geographically or by industry, of these guidelines? And are states typically enforcing more stringent guidelines than the national standards? And Palmina, I'll let you start off with that. I know you had some great ideas on it. Oh, you're on mute, Palmina.
Sorry.
There you go. That's fine.
Well, thank you for the question. I've had the benefit of overseeing projects in a variety of jurisdictions throughout the country, from a macro 50,000 foot level, and there's a consistent commonality in guidelines and, most importantly, how the project participants operate. Namely, what is front and center to every action, to every plan, construction output, and consideration is the health and safety of the workforce and the surrounding communities. While on a macro level, each locality has a slightly different take on what COVID-19 construction safety mitigation plan may look like, but they are all, in my opinion, built on the premise that when a worker comes to site, the worker is provided with operative gear, logistics, such as they are built on the premises that when a worker comes to site, the worker is provided with operative gear and logistics, just that when he or she returns home, they do so safely. They do so without bringing any harm to their family and their extended community. And the guidelines are a starting point, but the construction community, from ownership through subcontractors, designers, and owners, have embraced and pulling together this pandemic extraordinary experience very seriously. I mean, this is all very, very new to us, but when the regulatory framework ends in terms of enforcement, it's just a tip of the iceberg in respect to how the construction sector is enforcing complete compliance and protective measures.
Thank you. Amanda, you have particular expertise and experience to what's going on in New York City, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you, Diana. I'm currently involved in 2 long-term projects in New York, one that continued throughout from the declaration of the pandemic to the current time, and one that was put on hold. So I've experienced firsthand with both. And New York City was the first epicenter. And as this continues and the epicenter continues to move throughout the country and continues to move around the world, there are some lessons learned from how New York handled it. So New York started with all construction being deemed essential and could continue. And then in part in response to Palmina's point that safety is the focus of the industry, the workers and the unions and the labor were pushing back. And that will continue as this goes on, and if there's a second wave, and as places that haven't been hard hit to date, that those numbers do change. So New York then did change their stance, and in the designating what is essential versus not essential, there was a high degree of confusion in defining that term and what does it mean. And there was at times some disconnect between the state versus the city agencies, multiple registrations. And so kind of as it evolved, it was literally changing daily as executive orders were coming out, as different organizations at the state, city, and national level were issuing guidance. New York does have very robust procedures that they have put in place tied to the reopening and the entry of phase 1. And phase 1 for New York City started June 8th. And New York City DOB had a 30-day acknowledging this is new to everyone, a 30-day education and training period where their staff was visiting all of the sites and focusing on getting everything in place to do it correctly and comply with the guidelines that are out there. And now that grace period is over and the enforcement period starts. So it's the first time that project sites could potentially receive citations. At the federal level, there have been a lot of complaints COVID related in the thousands. I think an article I read earlier this week was over 13,000. But at the federal level, so those are complaints to OSHA. OSHA, I believe COVID related has only issued one such citation.
Thank you. Alexandria, you representing the construction industry as you do, what are you seeing as any similarities geographically or between the national and state guidelines and local guidelines?
So because we're a national company, we've dealt with different guidelines and ever-changing guidelines from Massachusetts all the way down to Texas. We adopted at Holt the New York State guidelines because those are the most stringent. So we follow those across the board in all of our states that we work in. And we've actually had a longer period of time to test out those requirements of facial coverings and hand sanitizing stations and postings and temperature scannings, because 75% of Holt's projects were considered essential. So we were ongoing construction during the pandemic. So we were seeing, people with COVID on our job sites, shutting down, deep cleaning sites, removing people, quarantining people that were in contact. So we actually had the ability to test it all out before it came law. So it was a good thing for us to see it so that we could feel it and live it. But now our Texas market is feeling what we felt in New York 2 months ago. So, they're coming to us in the main, in our main office in New York saying, what do we do? What's going on? And we're explaining to them, because we're more calm about it now because we've lived it for 3 months, right? We've all lived it up here. So the South is now dealing with it.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. So on to the next question and topic. What types of projects pose the greatest degree of complexity in light of COVID? Palmina, do you want to start off again with this one, in your opinion?
Yes, thank you. So I can only speak of the aviation industry, which I've spent my last 15 years. So I can speak of subways and ports and other build industries. But I would say that the aviation industry, as we all know from reading, hearing the news and reading papers or the media on the computers, it's getting hit very hard. And I'm in the opinion that the aviation construction pre-COVID was already a very complex area to work in. And there was already costs that were probably higher than work that is happening within the city. So my opinion is that the aviation industry is probably getting hit the hardest. We're working in an environment where each time you capture a piece of property to construct, you're taking an operation area away from the company, which means there's revenue loss. So if you take a gate, for example, and you shut a gate down, that means you can't bring the plane there. You can't have passengers. You're not selling that ticket. So from an aviation perspective, you're taking a COVID situation that has tons of complexity, that's unknown in an uncertain environment, and you're adding it to the existing complexity that's already there in the airport. So the cost of construction is already higher. You have tons of stakeholders involved besides the airline, the Port Authority, you have TSA, you have Customs and Borders, you have concessionaires, and you have other vested interest parties such as any third contracted party that's working there, whether it's baggage or ramp control or the wheelchairs. So it's already complex. This adds it, which makes, to me, in my opinion, the aviation industry is probably getting hit the hardest.
Alexandria, what is your perception on particular types of projects in the industry that will be the hardest to deal with during COVID and be impacted the most severely?
So as far as the hardest to work construction projects to work in during COVID was definitely our healthcare industry. We had a lot of hospitals that we were working in during COVID, building out quarantine rooms while patients are in hallways because they were overcrowded. That aspect of construction and keeping our manpower safe, that was very difficult to deal with. I have to say, as far as that, our healthcare industry was definitely the hardest. But when you go into Manhattan, the regulations with how many people can fit in an elevator, how many deliveries you can get, how many men on site you can have, because construction is a coordinated effort. You can't just have your electrician during the 7 to 3 shift and then your HVAC contractor show up at 10, because then he shows up, they're not there to coordinate. So it's very difficult to navigate the coordination as well as, what's going on in the exterior with, it's very difficult all around. It's just every aspect is different.
Yeah, so it almost sounds like the vertical type of construction has even more challenges than the horizontal or transit type, or its own special set of problems. Amanda, you being project specific and boots on the ground, what has been your experience and some of the unique complexities, and do you have an opinion as to whether there's any particular types of projects that pose additional hardships?
No, I agree with the complexity of high rise in New York City. That is very different than a project site in the Midwest where you're on acres and acres and you have plenty of lay down space and there are a lot more options. But I'm usually owner sided, and so owners are hit as well. We represent some public owners and public state and city entities, and those budgets have contracted significantly as well. I think most of the construction industry participants in New York City were shocked that, during the shutdown, everybody assumed that what you could advance was the design, so that projects were in the design phase would continue kind of uninterrupted. And the city, in large part due to budget constraints, shut down all of the design that was in progress for public. DDC put everything on pause, and I know I was shocked by that or surprised by that as well. So public entities, whether you're talking about a transportation entity, the ridership is down. Nobody's taking public transportation, or it's significantly reduced. Sales tax, people aren't out. The stores are closed. The restaurants are closed. A lot of revenue streams are not not the same pre-COVID, and that is impacting owners' decision makings and their flexibility, and that will impact the flexibility for settlement and create some between a rock and a hard place for a lot of projects.
Alexandria, do you have any opinions on which party seems to be getting hit the hardest on these COVID claims and trends and issues? Like, do you see a pattern of whether the public owner is having more hardships in dealing with this than the private contractor and developer?
I think it's both. Honestly, I think the contractors is getting hit. The owner is also getting hit. What we try to do to try to mitigate it is we have costs on a T&M basis. We'll show it to our client just in case there's a positive COVID case on site. We have to deep clean. You can't put a cost to that because you don't know what's going to happen on your job site. So it's kind of difficult. We don't ever want to gouge because it's just not right, because it's not the client's fault. It's, and it's not our fault. It's just what happened. So we try to be upfront with what the costs are, but we also try to think ahead more. And I think thinking ahead really helps to mitigate some of that.
Have the owners been fairly cooperative in taking these types of T&M expenses and out-of-pocket kind of costs for dealing with the COVID?
Yeah, a lot of our clients are okay with it. You know, it's not that they like it, but they know that there's nothing that we could do about it. You know, if we have to have a temperature screener on the job site, you know, we have to have it. It's a mandate. So they are okay with it because, I mean, what we do at Holt might be different from everybody else. We actually show the client the invoice from the temperature screening company, this, because we feel the pain. We don't want to do that. So we're very, very transparent with our clients, and they appreciate that.
But as far as, you know, obviously this probably wasn't something that was in your contracts pre-COVID that, you know, was anticipated. So under what kind of clauses are you able to get these additional monies for dealing with the COVID? Did you have to enter into an amendment or a change order of some type, or did you find a niche in the contract or a provision in the contract?
It's a change order. It's usually a change order.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Alexandria, what has been your experience on this topic in working with the airports and the airlines? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Palmina. I'm sorry. Thank you, Alexandria. My bad. Thank you, Alexandria. I meant Palmina. Sorry.
Yeah, my experience has been life transforming, Diana. I'm like, it just really has. It's been life transforming for an aviation company as a company itself, and to a lot of what Alexandra was saying earlier. There's a lot to consider. There's a lot to consider from employee and passenger perception. So we are not only ensuring that we'd like our employees to come to work, and they'd come to work and the area is safe and they would be willing and wanting to come to work voluntarily, but also the same with the passengers, that there's an environment where the airline industry is creating a safe environment for passengers to get through, into the building and through the building and on an airplane and feel safe getting to their destination. COVID has transformed the industry. It's going to be very interesting as to what that definitively means, because we're in it now. And although many of us are sitting back and trying to guess what's going to happen next, guess what is the virus going to hit, what is going to be the next mandate, is it going to be another requirement, how are people going to feel? Companies are also trying to preserve themselves, and people are trying to keep themselves safe. So it's very difficult to tell what the end game is going to be. And I say this with ever so lightly. There may be some blessing in all of us on this living through COVID, right? I mean, I don't know if this Zoom thing is the perfect blessing, but there's blessings to sit back and think about what's happening in life. And hopefully very, very shortly, we'll say, oh, we survived that. New norm, but here we are. We're coming to a new norm.
Thank you. Beth, I'd like to turn to you and get your input on what you are seeing as the common, how has the industry been reacting from the insurance side, and what can we expect to see going forward with respect to availability of coverage on COVID type related claims?
So the COVID related claims, I was actually just on a webinar earlier today in regards to NCCI and the workers' compensation. A lot is changing in regards to that, whether or not it's going to be covered under workers' compensation. NCCI has stated, for the NCCI states, that workers' compensation claims that are COVID-19 will not be promulgated with the mods of any client, which is a positive on that side, because it is such a new for everybody, and it's not anticipated. It was never anticipated under workers' compensation. So that will help for them from a mod perspective. However, what we're seeing is whether or not it be considered first and foremost a workers' compensation claim. A lot of claims are being put under the healthcare side of things, if they can be, because it's very difficult first and foremost to state that it was definitively caused under workers' compensation, that they didn't get it when they were traveling to work, or they didn't get it when they went to the grocery store after work, or they didn't get it, the night before when they were with their family just outside playing in the backyard with their neighbor. So it's very difficult for somebody to say, I definitively got it at work. So I think that's going to be the biggest challenge from a workers' compensation perspective.
Well, what about what you see as available insurance and coverage going forward for what the industry will be asking for and looking for from the insurance industry, and what you think the insurance industry, how they will react?
Well, we're already seeing exclusions on every single 7/1 renewal. We had exclusions for virus at this point in time, not COVID, but virus. So the exclusions are coming out and are being put on the general liability policies, property policies, and everything like that. So the marketplace is not ready to accept this risk yet, due to the fact that they haven't built it into their rating mechanisms at this point in time. So until they really get a handle on it and can build it in and actually charge properly for it, you will see the exclusions continue.
So there's, at least for now, there's really no avenue to insurance coverage for a pandemic or virus related claim.
There is some property and builder's risk coverage that has some amount of coverage. A lot of policies out there, however, have an exclusion for a virus already on there prior to COVID-19 happening. So a lot of property and business interruption property policies and builder's risk policies for construction in place right now will already have had that virus exclusion on there. So it's going to be difficult. Not to say that Alliant, as a broker, we are trying to find every single coverage for our client that we can find out there. But it is going to be up to the courts. And unfortunately, what New York states could be covered, it's going to be state by state specific. That California is going to say, yes, it's covered. New York could then say, no, it's not covered under the exact same scenario, which we always have nowadays, is that it's a state by state legal environment that's going to determine what happens.
Other than the health related, workers' comp versus medical coverage, what are the other types of claims you're seeing that are COVID related for, that contractors and owners are trying to recover?
So we have not seen general liability claims as of yet. From a construction perspective, I could see those coming in more so from a entertainment perspective, like Disneyland just opened up. So, I could see somebody saying something about that. From a construction perspective, we have not seen that yet. Not to say that they won't be coming in, that, a class action couldn't come in from workers saying if, 100 workers on a job site were exposed, that they could say that the general contractor or the owner did not provide the type of protection that they deserved during COVID. So we have not seen a mass claims like that come in as of yet. I do anticipate that, like anything else, we will get some of those coming in.
Heidi, what about you? What are you seeing in your industry and in your experience with the common claims, the types of amendments and responses to COVID related relief requests?
Yeah, well, on claims, just to pick up on Beth's point, there may not be coverage out there and the status of coverage is uncertain, but we've been telling our clients, make your claim. If you think you have a viable potential claim, make your claim to at least stick your flag in the ground, because then if the courts end up saying that there is coverage in a certain circumstance, then hopefully you have a chance of recovering something. But for ongoing projects, the claims are, the parties are trying, I think, to work cooperatively, kind of in the way that Alexandria was mentioning, where there is a discussion and people are talking about you know, what are the costs that are coming in and how can we deal with these, because they are real costs to the contractors and they are real costs to the owners. And you know, as Alexandria mentioned, this is no one's fault, right? It's not like it's the contractor's fault that this has happened or the owner's fault. So trying to figure out how best to share the costs and manage that risk has been challenging. So on ongoing projects, obviously we have, you know, there are different buckets of costs. One bucket is just change costs. Yesterday, we didn't have to do PPE and temperature checks and site cleaning. Today we do. It's a change. That's a change order. Those claims really don't seem very controversial. Then you have your time impact claims, which is, okay, New York shut down the project. Boston shut down my project. I'm still carrying costs even though people aren't working. I still have people that I dedicated to your project on a full-time basis. I have to pay their salaries. And now what am I supposed to do? Yeah, you know, some of the contractors want to bill them to the project at, you know, the full rate that they had been billing them, you know, while the project was under construction. And some of the owners are saying, okay, well, hang on, that seems like a little much. Can we figure out a way to balance this? Do you have other projects where you could repurpose them? So for example, if it's a Holt construction and they have essential projects that are still moving forward, like healthcare, can you take them off of this high-rise project and send them over to a healthcare project so that, you know, you're not losing money and we're not funding somebody who isn't working? Now, there are a lot of reasons why that may or may not work, but it's that kind of, you know, thinking about the ideas. Those extended general conditions costs. But your time-related costs will also be your cost of materials and equipment. You've got a hoist sitting on the job, trailers, cranes. It doesn't really make sense to take all of that down so that you can stop paying that rental bill and then put it up, you know, who knows, a month later, 2 months later. But the more complicated one, even more complicated than the time-related costs, is sort of a hybrid, and that's the loss of efficiency claims. And when you have a new OSHA rule or a state rule that says you have to maintain social distancing, your maximum site capacity can only be 25%, 50%, what have you, or you can't have, you know, 5 crews working here because of social distancing, you can only have 2. Well, now you have loss of efficiency claims, and those are both, those have costs associated with them, and then obviously they extend the time of completion. I think those I haven't seen just yet, but I think that is sort of right underneath the surface waiting to explode, and the parties are going to have to work through that.
So on some of these claims, is the contractor trying to rely upon like a change of law type change order because of the shutdown? Or I mean, what are you seeing as the basis for, I mean, obviously, you know, COVID could fit a lot of different boxes as to a relief event, but what are you seeing as the most common basis the contractors is asking for relief, and how, you know, how are the owners reacting, and are they pushing back on, like, oh no, you know, I understand I think what you said was a good point about not necessarily getting the full markup and whatnot that you would normally get for change order of relief event. But do you see is there any kind of commonality as to how the contractors are asking for relief and how they're asking for it and what they're saying as far as in their notice? And are they following the notice provisions as if, you know, it was, you know, a change order? Because there's a lot of notice provision, you know, protocol usually, and you know, that could become very difficult to try to keep up with in the environment of COVID. So,
and contractors love doing that too.
That was a lot of questions, but yeah. anything you have to offer on that?
Yeah, no, first of all, I mean, the premise underlying your question really is the contract controls. So when you do have an ongoing project and you have this COVID impact, you really do need to take a hard look at the contract and see what it says in terms of your rights to recover. So of course, the primary provision that everybody has been turning to is the force majeure provision. And that is the one that people are trying to capitalize on, but a lot of contracts will say that for force majeure, you only get time, not money. Or they'll say there's a 30-day grace period. So you eat the first 30 days of costs, and then the owner will only pay the actual reasonable and unavoidable costs that are incurred after that 30-day grace period. So number one, the contract controls. Number two, usually it's a force majeure provision. But if that force majeure provision doesn't get folks where they want to be, we've actually seen some pretty creative arguments about how they can sort of use other contract provisions as a basis for recovery when that one doesn't get them where they want to be. The change, I think, again, I think the change claim is pretty straightforward. You know, it was either a requirement or it wasn't. But in terms of even when the contract says you're limited to your actual reasonable and unavoidable costs incurred as a result of the force majeure, there's still a lot of discussion. Because again, if somebody says, well, I want to charge, you know, I have 8 people that I've dedicated to your project, I want to charge for all 8 people. It's kind of like, okay, wait, hang on. Are those people working? Can they be repurposed? What, you know, what is in it? So the wage rate for a worker often includes a lot of different things, including bonuses. So should we be paying that full wage rate, which includes bonuses, when the rest of the country is having layoffs and furloughs? But I mean, it gets, you can get into the weeds and that kind of thing. And I think what I'm encouraged by is I actually see a lot of owners and contractors trying to work cooperatively with the spirit of, look, we're all in this together. Let's try to figure out a way to make this work. And I think, you know, part of our advice to our owner clients is get ahead of this. Don't wait until the contractor has incurred 3 months of cost and then try to fight about who's responsible. Get ahead of it. Talk to them now. Talk to them about what costs they expect to incur, if there are any alternatives, and ways that you can mutually agree on how to make this easier for everyone.
Thank you. Amanda, what about you? You're dealing with this daily on ongoing projects. What are your thoughts on the commonality of claims and how contractors are approaching owners, and what are you seeing in this?
Yes, I usually see in the claim and notice letters, contractors cite every possible provision that could be a basis for relief for a given fact or whatever the claim is. They will list all of them. And to Heidi's point, that if there are different remedies, they will absolutely make the argument for under the provision that has the broadest remedy and the broadest recovery, because that's the strongest position that they can take. So we are seeing a lot of notice letters, constant updates, as circumstances change and the contractor has more information, they're updating that claim and sending a new letter, supplementing with subcontractor costs or subcontractor availability. They're providing the time impact analysis if they have to demonstrate that it was a critical path delay. So they really are trying to position themselves in the strongest, in the best position possible, and give the owner the information that the owner needs. I've seen that to Heidi's point of cooperation, because owner's question are related to not only dispositioning the claims that they're receiving, that's a priority. And I think I've seen everybody trying to follow the contract language. But then the next question is, depending on how many months are left for bigger projects that have a year or more left, you're going to be enduring a potential second wave. So it's also trying to figure out proactively on the bigger projects, how do we have cost and schedule certainty? How do we, in a potential second wave or the fall, how are we going to then figure out where we are? Because to what we've been talking about, you can't execute the safety meetings in the same way. The guidelines are encouraging staggering shifts. Construction requires cooperation, and we have to figure out how to do that cooperation and collaboration in the safest way possible. But it is a lot of the assumptions in terms of the man hours to get work done for schedules that were created pre-COVID, those fundamental productivity assumptions might not be valid going forward. So they really agree with it seems like for the bigger projects, we're seeing we have to figure out a way through this. And it is in a recognition that it is unprecedented and most complex. Every other force majeure claim I've seen before COVID has been much more discreet. where it has a more defined start and a more defined end, and it impacts something very specific, whether it's a hurricane, it comes and goes and the storm ends. The typhoon in Southeast Asia, you have to figure out how to get that subcontractor or fabricator back up and running, or if you have transportation delays or issues that way. Coronavirus, COVID, for what we have seen and what we can potentially see in a global second wave situation is additional disruptions on all of those levels. So it is the most complex.
So, Heidi, I'll ask you first. Are you seeing in new contracts that because of the outstanding current knowledge on the existence of COVID, are you seeing it as a carve out now, as a force majeure event going forward? And I mean, how do you reconcile risk allocation with so much uncertainty of what the resurgence will bring, and who knows what the laws will be a month from now versus even a year from now? So how's the industry dealing with the new contracts on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing a lot of folks really keying into how how COVID will impact their project, and people, of course, are taking a harder look at the force majeure provisions. And I think you will probably see a shift in industry standard in that regard. So the industry standard to date, by many accounts, is time, not money. In other words, if there's a force majeure event, we'll give you time, but we'll give you money because it's not your fault and it's not my fault. I don't think that industry standard is going to hold up going forward, or at least not as it relates to COVID, because this is a different impact than people are used to. Like Mandy was suggesting, it's one thing to have a Hurricane Sandy, where it affects you, maybe it affects that region, and then it's done, as opposed to COVID, which is a global pandemic and has affected supply chains and just every possible facet of life. So folks are saying, how can we resolve this? A lot of folks are doing that through the force majeure provision, but it doesn't have to be that way. And frankly, I think contractors just want to make sure that they're being reimbursed. They don't really care what the provision is or how it happens, as long as it happens. And I think folks are really taking a hard look at how to do this in the best way. We always recommend to our owner clients, don't put all of the risk on the contractor and then walk out giving yourself a high five because you think you've dodged a bullet, because you've probably just paid more than you need to pay for that risk. Because a contractor, if you're putting all the risk on them, of course, is going to have to include cost in its number to protect itself from something that may never come to pass. So we say, don't put all the risk on the contractor. Figure out a way to agree upon the cost and risk sharing at this juncture, and then maybe do a dedicated contingency fund where that fund can only be used for COVID costs. Agree on what those COVID costs are, and maybe create an incentive so that if there's a dedicated COVID contingency and they end up spending less than what's in the contingency, maybe they get a share of the savings. Because one of the things that owners are worried about is, well, if we just give contractors a blank check, there goes our money, and it'll cost way more than we have a budget to manage. And you say, okay, well then why don't you give them an incentive so that if they decide to buy the 95-cent PPE mask as opposed to the $6 mask, there's some savings. So that's one avenue. The other is, not trying. Folks have trouble reaching an agreement where they try to deal with these costs as one big goal, because they're not all the same types of costs. So maybe separate them and say, well, general requirements, when you have to pay for a crane or a hoist, that's a cost the contractor can't really avoid. So maybe that's a fair cost to share, or owner pays, or what have you. General conditions cost, that's their own staffing. Maybe that is a cost that they can manage to a certain extent. So maybe you can have a different arrangement there. But just delineating the different types of costs, coming to an agreement as to how you'll handle them, maybe having some incentives to try to help curb those costs, and really making sure you have the discussion rather than leaving it to force majeure provisions.
Yeah, because right now everyone is in agreement that COVID and its potential resurgence is foreseeable. So, it can't necessarily going forward be, it's not best to be dealt with likely as a force majeure event for the reasons you just articulated. Alexandria, what are your thoughts on this as far as what you think the force majeure event will look like going forward, and whether COVID will be carved out of that and dealt with as a separate type of relief event?
I think it might be that way, separate. They might separate COVID from that, because there's no way to define what is going to happen. We don't know. We don't, somebody in my organization always says, you don't know what you don't know, right? You can't, how do you plan for what you don't know? But, as long as you're making a plan based on what we know already, right? So we know that supply chains were interrupted months ago. We know that if there is a resurgence, where's it going to come from? Where are my materials for this long-term project being procured from? Should I order them now? How about if I, order my materials, my long lead items, let's order them right now. Even though I haven't even put a shovel in the ground, let's just get them all here. We'll store them because it's cheaper to store them than it is to wait for them, right? So that's kind of some of the things that we're working on. If we have to go to staggered shifts on a project, what does that look like? What is the best way to look at it? Like, now that I don't want to say we're in a lull, because we're really not, but we're not in the height right now. So now is the time to look and say, okay, what does 3 months from now look like? If it comes back, it'll look like 3 months back from now, what that looked like. So let's make a plan for that. Let's sit down with our clients. Let's say, this is what we think is going to happen. This is our plan to mitigate it. This is the menu, the T&M of the cost that might happen. And let's have a discussion, because like I said before, and like Heidi said, it's not the client's fault. It's not our fault, so we don't want to make it arbitrary. We want to make it work. So if anything that COVID brought out of the industry, I feel like it made us more apt to have a conversation before, slinging a notice to a client, or calling the client saying, listen, I have these contract provisions. I have to do this. I'm just letting you know, instead of just, throwing it out there. So.
Yeah, those are all, I think, workable solutions that make a lot of sense. It's almost like we have to carve out COVID as a separate provision and try our best in the industry and in cooperation with the owner to set a baseline for what we know now and what we anticipate as far as knowledge of the COVID related additional costs and protocol, and then set that as a baseline for if it materially changes and adds costs or time, then and then have a mechanism for that additional cost and time like you were describing. And I think you're absolutely right. I think this is, and I think Palmina said this earlier, is that COVID in some ways might be a blessing, because in some certain ways, because I think it's caused, at least in my experience, even very contentious projects that are in litigation and it's caused the owner and the concessionaire or the developer contractor to force themselves to work together and come up with solutions. And I've seen in a few instances where it's actually improved the relationship, like I said, when there's underlying pretty nasty litigation. Well, those ladies were the topics I had, and everyone here has great insight and advice on this topic. I'm just gonna, Amanda, I'm gonna open it up to you and kind of go around the panel group and let you have your last words, and then I'm not sure if we've received any questions or not. So go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, I was going to piggyback off what Alexandria said. It reminded me, I have seen that on the owner side, a renewed interest in the risk register. That's something that is very frequently required and prepared and then kind of sits on the shelf and be ignored. And I've seen it recently be used, especially for projects that are in the earlier side or still have a substantial to the point of how can we manage the future risk, to Alexandria's point of what are the long lead time. There's much more collaborative discussion around those issues and what the options to mitigate to keep the project on schedule deal with any future issues.
Palmina, any final last words on this topic or others that we covered?
Diane, I just want to emphasize what you said earlier. I've spent most of my career trying to create collaboration among the team members because collaboration creates a win-win situation, right? The common goal for everyone is for people to feel satisfied that they've gotten at least some of the intent of what they were looking for. And I think with that, they're willing to make compromises. So with this COVID, ironically, I've spent years trying to do this with contracts, which is against a grain of salt. But yeah, COVID has made people speak differently, take the time to listen to each other. And to your point, Amanda, it's made time to identify risk logs that have been developed through programs. And it's going to be, and I've said this earlier, it's going to be telling what the future is, but as long as we stay optimistic and we respect and nurture the industry that we're in, because this is America, right? We do have to survive. We do, this is global. I don't mean it's America, but for us here on this Zoom meeting, we have to survive. The world can't come to an end. It's impossible. So we do have to continue doing what we're doing, having these seminars, figuring out how to get through this all. And in a little to what Alexandra alluded to, keeping our head up high and having respect and consideration for each other. So I'm optimistic that's going to happen in our world.
Thank you. Beth, do you have any words of wisdom for the industry on what would be helpful as far as what you see in contract provisions on this topic to make it a little more palatable to the insurance agency and agencies in industry to provide some kind of coverage?
Well, as Amanda said, one of the big things is moving forward is going to be looking at those, safety plans and everything else, and how contractors, subcontractors, and owners are going to be addressing, what if another pandemic comes into play, or not just a pandemic, but any kind of massive world-changing event such as this. I mean, I think everybody's going to be relooking at their safety plans. Everybody's going to be revisiting a lot of things to make this not be such a stoppage of everybody's life and just global change to everything. It's impacting, like they were saying, everything, the supply chain line, how you work, how everybody does work. We see the construction industry still going. Obviously, a lot of people might be moving out of New York City in the future. So like construction in Connecticut could be going up, and, construction in the Midwest could be going up, because I think there's going to be a lot more people working from home. I think it's just going to change a lot of things going forward.
Heidi, you want the last word here on your thoughts before we close out?
I'll keep it brief. I'm a big fan of best practices. So kind of like how Holt is doing, figure out your protocol, refine it, make sure you've got a kick-ass program that you can, then file away. And then, as Beth says, should something like this ever happen again, you'll have the actual benefit of that and can roll it out. But that's it. I'm good.
Well, Sarah and Jenna, I believe we've gone through everything, and unless you two have any final comments, we're done.
No further comments, but thank you all for your participation today. It was wonderful.